Hello and welcome to Occult Lives. I'm here in South East London with Joe McKeany. I met Joe when I replied to an advert for esoteric teachings, and Joe here was the teacher. Joe also is a healer of quite a few different practitioners, and you're also into Qigong, which is one of my favourites too. So Joe, can I ask you to just say a little bit about yourself?
Okay, what I do mainly is Gurdjieff. I do Gurdjieff workshops, and I give Gurdjieff lectures and talks in the TS. That's the Theosophical Society in central London, and that's usually on a Sunday. But I'm also a qualified counsellor and therapist, which involves many different healing arts such as theta healing, hypnotherapy, and tapas and EFT, emotional freedom technique.
Well, I met you first off for the Gurdjieff work. What are your workshops about today that you deal with?
We mainly do Gurdjieff and Gurdjieff's teaching, but also we do Ouspensky and all of Gurdjieff's direct and indirect students like Orage and Bennett and various other teachers that have since passed away, like Maurice Nicole, who died in Wales in '94. He was a very interesting man. He was an Englishman who was a brilliant student of Gurdjieff, and he wrote 5 volumes called Psychological Commentaries on Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, and they are very valuable corpus of knowledge on the Gurdjieff esoteric wisdom.
With Gurdjieff, many people now call it the fourth way or the fourth way of work, which is what he himself was saying towards, that there are 3 different ways of looking at life, and we have to put them all together to make that fourth. Could you perhaps have a little say about what that means?
Okay, that's a really good point, because what Gurdjieff explains is that in the background behind all of these 3 main ways that we find in life, the 3 ways are the way of the yogi, the way of the monk, and the way of the fakir. So the way of the yogi is the way of the intellectual man or the intellectual woman, and that is veering towards the mind, a bias towards the mind, the spiritual practice of the mind. The way of the monk is a spiritual practice. We all see it in life. We see monks, we see monasteries. We all know what the way of the monk is about. And then the way of the fakir is not so common. It's found in India. We all know, we've seen on TV the man with the turban and the strange robes, or maybe just a loincloth lying on a bed of nails, and this is basically the way of the fakir. It's conquering the physical body. So these 3 ways can be found in ordinary open society, in ordinary culture, but Gurdjieff explains that these 3 ways come from a bigger way. And this bigger way he calls the core teaching or the esoteric path. And he explains that all of these 3 paths that we find in ordinary life come from originally the core teaching.
And this is the teaching you're carrying on in your workshops?
Yeah, this is the teaching, Gurdjieff's teaching, which is it's actually a very high level teaching. It's a very high level teaching, and it requires quite a lot of experience in working with the material, trying to understand it, trying to apply it to your own life, and trying to help other people in the process. So it's actually a very big and a very deep system of knowledge and wisdom.
But if someone wanted to come to your class, they can be a beginner.
Yes. Most people who come to the workshops here in Blackheath are beginners, or they have read a little bit about Gurdjieff or something about Ouspensky. In fact, we get people from all over the world, from Moscow, from Spain, from Italy, people from Ireland, people from various walks of life and various professions. Yeah.
Because Gurdjieff was saying that he found like a lost knowledge or a forgotten knowledge more. It's not something new he's bringing, is it? It's just
Okay. Actually, Gurdjieff says that what he has brought is completely new. It is 100% new. It has been unknown up until the present time. And there have been some mistakes made about this, because Gurdjieff did not make this clear what actually happened in his youth when he came across this body of knowledge when he was introduced to the Sarmung monastery the Sarmung Brotherhood, which are an esoteric school, which it is thought was situated in Afghanistan in the Hindu Kush, but of course he never revealed exactly where it was. But there was a mistake made by many Gurdjieff students about this knowledge and about the Sarmung Brotherhood. Many people say, many of his students say, and you will find this on YouTube and on the internet, that Gurdjieff went to Ethiopia, he went to Solomon Islands, he went to India, he went to Siberia, which is all very true. And they say that he brought fragments of this esoteric teaching from all these sources, all these countries and all these different places, and he welded them together into a new whole, if you like. And then he made this new hybrid and he brought this to the West. Actually, that is not really what happened. What really happened was that he did actually do this. He went to all these countries and he found various different fragments of knowledge, but none of these fragments of knowledge were sufficient for him to use it to work on himself. So there was a problem for him. So eventually he intuited that what he was looking for was an unbroken line of schools, wisdom schools, from ancient times. And he intuited that they should still exist on this earth. And actually they do. And he made contact eventually, after many trials and tribulations, he made contact with the Sarmung Brotherhood. And it was they who gave him this high-level knowledge. He didn't piece it together in a fragmentary form from all over the world. That is not exactly what happened. Although, obviously, in the process, he did gather some very important fragments of knowledge from all of these countries. But he got the complete system from the Sarmung Brotherhood, from an esoteric school.
And for that school to have taken him on, they would have wanted him to have been at least a little bit learned in that kind of way anyway, wouldn't they? They wouldn't have just accepted someone that knew nothing.
That's it, yeah. From what I can gather from all the information and knowledge that's available, it seems that these core esoteric schools, if you like, are always on the lookout, in a certain respect, for candidates who might be really suitable for their work. And obviously at the time, Gurdjieff, among several other people in his group, came up on their radar, so to speak, and they brought him into their camp and trained him, and he proved to be a very suitable student, a very suitable candidate for this esoteric work. And so he reached a very high level. And it is also said that in return for this training and this spiritual development, he took an obligation upon himself to come to the West and disseminate this knowledge to us, to people in the West. And that, it seems, is exactly what he did during his life, the second part of his life.
I suppose we should add that this was during the late 1800s, early 1900s, this was all happening.
Yeah. He came to St. Petersburg in 1912, where Ouspensky discovered him, or he discovered Ouspensky, depending on which way you want to look at it. Mm. Ouspensky had been in India, and he'd been looking for schools, because Ouspensky was probably one of the top 100 minds in the world. He is estimated by many people at that time in the esoteric sphere to have been in the top 100 minds, geniuses, or maybe several levels above genius, if you like. And he was in India looking for these schools, because he also had intuited that these type of schools must exist. But all that Ouspensky found were schools of monks and schools of yogis and schools of fakirs. And they told him basically that he would have to go into seclusion from the outer world, and he would have to give up everything for quite a number of years. And Ouspensky didn't want to ditch his secular life and his earnings and his reputation as a journalist and a mathematician and a writer. So he felt that those paths were not for him. But then in 1912 he met Gurdjieff in St. Petersburg, and this is very well documented, his first meeting with Gurdjieff at a cafe in St. Petersburg. And that was a very interesting meeting indeed, because it's described in his very brilliant book, In Search of the Miraculous, how he met Gurdjieff. And he was introduced to him at a cafe. And at this meeting, Ouspensky recounts how he met Gurdjieff, and he said that he was astonished because here was this man sitting at this cafe, dressed in Western clothes and Western garb, with a hat and an overcoat and a tie, and yet he looked like a very, very powerful Arab sheikh. So he tells this fantastic story, and you can't help but be impressed by the way Ouspensky narrates this in his book and how he explains his astonishment. He felt that Gurdjieff was thinly disguised, as he put it, He looked like more like a very noble sheik disguised as a Westerner, so it really had this kind of strange effect on Ouspensky. And Ouspensky then became a student of Gurdjieff, and he became part of Gurdjieff's groups in St. Petersburg and later in Moscow.
Because Ouspensky was, then wrote, was it The Fourth Way?
Yeah.
Which was one of the more accessible books on Gurdjieff's work for people. A lot of Gurdjieff's work didn't actually come out for many years, did it? So Ouspensky was quite well known through that book. He himself was waiting to hopefully be picked as a candidate, wasn't he?
Yeah, Ouspensky's books are really, they are sort of, they are the books that one approaches first of all, rather than Gurdjieff's books, because Gurdjieff's books are written in a very specific way, as you probably already know, especially his magnum opus, Beelzebub's Tales, or otherwise known as All and Everything. It's written couched in a particular prose, which is very difficult for the beginner. So people are normally in this field recommended to read Ouspensky first, that is, i.e. In Search of the Miraculous, or The Fourth Way, or some other books by Orage or Maurice Nicole. Maurice Nicole in particular is a very good primer for people to start with and begin with, because his writing is very simple and very straightforward, and it's easy to access Gurdjieff through his students, as it were. So yeah, any of these books is a good opener for Gurdjieff, either Ouspensky, Orage, or Bennett, or Maurice Nicole. And
you yourself, in your workshops, you work on Gurdjieff's work, so you're hoping to bring that a bit more accessible into the modern day. So maybe you'd like to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, the workshops I do here in Blackheath are interesting in the sense that people come here, and some people know a little bit about Gurdjieff, some people know a little bit about Ouspensky. So it is basically a foundation course on Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, and we go into all of the principles. We go into all of the materials in quite a deep way after a number of sessions. These workshops are normally done over a 3-hour period on Sundays, and they run for usually 6 to 10 weeks in the beginning, and then we do further workshops for people who want to continue. So we do fairly detailed work with the Gurdjieff material and Ouspensky's material, and of course we use Maurice Nicole as well and the other students. And it's a very good way to get into Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, is to work with people who have some experience of the material. Whereas if you're working by yourself, it's fine, you can read the material, but if you sit down with a group of people, they can go through their experiences, their life experiences, their spiritual experiences, and you can make great progress and move forward faster than working by yourself.
I found that myself with a lot of your groups. When you're working in these groups, it's a lot of looking at yourself, isn't it? At your, as we was talking before about the monks, the yogas, the fakirs, we're looking at our mental states, our physical states, and how we can bring them all together, because we're trying to find, I suppose, the real purpose of ourselves. Like look at ourselves, our subconscious, the mind, how we mentally affect people.
Yeah, Gurdjieff is a very, very radical teaching. It's not like anything you will find in ordinary society in terms of philosophy that you will find in college. It's so radically different, because you have to reassess everything in your life. And it's not a one-off, one-time reassessment of your life. You have to keep reassessing, and you have to keep looking at your conditioning, because this is one of the main themes of Gurdjieff, is our conditioning and our programming from our culture. And there are 3 aspects to our conditioning, and your listeners might be interested in the 3 aspects. The 3 aspects are the 3 levels of karma. And the 3 levels of karma are the 3 levels which affect us most in life, and they can be calibrated very easily. And the first level of karma that affects us very strongly is, of course, our parents. And the second level of karma, which affects us equally strongly, is our culture. And the third is our peers, our friends, their belief systems, their habits, and their conditioning impringes upon us very strongly. So one of the things we can do in the beginning with the Gurdjieff work is to look at how our parents have affected us. What beliefs have we taken on board mechanically and absorbed them from our family and from our parents? And this is a really important part of the work, because when we look at some of the things that we have taken on board, we'll find out quite often that they're very artificial, they're not real. So the more of this stuff we can dump, the better for ourselves. The more conditioning we can get rid of, the more programming we can get rid of. So also we can look at the programming from our culture. But this requires a great degree of sincerity. So the Gurdjieff work is all about working on different facets of our psychology at one time. So if we look at the 3 levels of karma, then we're going to be working on how our friends have affected us. This is another very powerful aspect, because we can see sometimes in our teens that our friends affected us, maybe in that we took drugs or we smoked or we had certain belief systems because they had these things going for them, and we sort of bought into this. So we can look back, everybody can do this, and some of us can be pretty clean in this respect, and some of us have a lot of negative influences, and some of us have positive influences. So there can be positive and negative karma in this respect, relating to our parents, our culture, and our peers, our friends. So yeah, looking at our conditioning and our programming is really incredibly important, and it is a continuous process. We don't stop doing this. We keep doing. So we shed various layers of conditioning, and the more conditioning we shed, the more we can work also on our sincerity, because the two go hand in hand. Being sincere, there's no point in looking at our conditioning if we're not sincere and open about what we find. We have to be ruthless about what we find with ourselves. In the beginning, we're not dealing with other people, we're dealing with ourselves. So we have to be ruthlessly sincere about what we find, and we must be prepared to ditch that which is negative or hold us back or creates blockage in us. So we must be ruthless in that respect. So it's a very radical teaching, and Gurdjieff is not just a teaching we have to practice. Teaching, there's no point. In the beginning, there's a lot of intellectual work. We have to read, we have to absorb, we have to understand the principles, but essentially we have to start using it. This is so important. From as early as possible, we have to start using it.
One of the main things I remember, you just reminded me, is lies, and the lies that go on in this world. And we lie to ourselves, we lie to others, we have the government lying to us, everybody lies. And it's very difficult, as an example, using that to get on in this world, which is why this work, I think, is very good for ourselves, because it's teaching us how to look at ourselves, look at the lies, how to deal with it.
Yes, lying is a whole subject within the remit of esoteric studies. It is a complete subject in itself. It takes quite a bit of time to look at lying, and it's a very important facet of esotericism. In fact, Ouspensky, who was I mentioned, who was several levels above genius, learned from Gurdjieff. He said that psychology, lying is, let me get this right, the psychology of man is the psychology of lying. This is what he said. The psychology of man is the psychology of lying. So if we study people very, very closely and study ourselves, we will find different layers of lies inhabiting our consciousness and inhabiting society, because we are in many ways a reflection of our own culture and the society that we live in, because we are influenced so strongly by what we're surrounded by, and we're not even aware that we are influenced so strongly. So we have to become aware, afresh and new, of these influences that so strongly affect us. And we have to start to see them for real, not just think about them intellectually, but we have to see how they affect us, how they affect our decisions, how we do things. Our cognitive ability is definitely affected by our culture and what is going on around us on the TV, in the newspapers, in our friends. It affects us like a morphic field. This morphic field affects us very strongly in so many different levels. And part of the esoteric work is to try and step outside this morphic field. So everybody knows in the spiritual field, in spiritual work, they have this saying, be in the world, but be not of the world. So this is connected with Gurdjieff. We have to try and live in life and be in society, but still try and not be so strongly affected by it. Yeah.
Because part of your teaching was about I should quote you here, the diminishing of man's cognitive ability, which kind of is covering what you're saying here.
Yeah, this is a very interesting point, and it's probably one of the things that I've learned more and more about in the past 10 years. Before 10 years ago, I knew about this in a sort of intellectual way, but now I've become aware of it on a much deeper level. Gurdjieff explains that there were higher civilizations on the earth before our modern day civilization, and most people find this very difficult to deal with. In fact, most people cannot deal with it. We all know that we are probably technologically the highest, in the highest stage we've come so far on the earth. But Gurdjieff said that man's development is really not based on technology. It's based on being. That's being with a capital B. And he said that in the ancient civilizations of the earth, for instance, there was one in pre-pharaonic Egypt that Gurdjieff talks about a lot. And this is a very interesting subject, because it's just recently come to light that the top geologists and the top Egyptologists in the world have now come to understand that the Great Pyramids are much older than they thought, and the Sphinx is also much older than we thought. Now, the Sphinx was generally dated to 2600 BC. But this now seems to be very childish and very infantile, because we have this brilliant Professor Schock from
Robert Schock, yes.
Yeah, from Boston University, who turned up, I think it was either 1990 or 92. He turned up to do a routine geological survey on the Sphinx and the backdrop, that is the plain and the geology in the background to the Sphinx, and he was quite shocked to find that there was all of this hydrology, these markings caused by flowing water and rainfall, both on the Sphinx and the backdrop to the Sphinx. And so he, from his experience, has dated provisionally the Sphinx to be much older than this 2600 BC, and he says, in fact, it cannot be, it's impossible, from the hydrology, that is the water markings and the precipitation markings on the Sphinx itself and the background, that he said that it's more probable that the Sphinx goes back to 7500 BC, and maybe even 10,500 BC. He said in that band of time, it's probably somewhere there. And Gurdjieff was talking about this in 1912. He was saying that the Sphinx is much older than we all thought in Europe, and he was saying it back then, but nobody was listening. And in fact, when in his youth he had come across a map of pre-Sans Egypt, and many students of Gurdjieff have said that on this map of pre-Sans Egypt, which he acquired, there was probably the Sphinx, and probably the pyramids, the Great Pyramids, were probably on there as well. So the reason I'm mentioning this ancient civilization is because Gurdjieff tells us that this ancient civilization was this pre-pharaonic Egyptian civilization was a child of Atlantis. That this civilization originally came from Atlantis. Some people, some adepts, and some people migrated from Atlantis, and they ended up in the delta, the Nile Delta in Egypt. And this was the beginnings of the great civilization that was in place before dynastic Egypt. So many people today talk about dynastic Egypt, and they talk about all of the pharaohs and all of the hieroglyphics. But there are many interesting things about dynastic Egypt alone, even if we don't even talk about pre-pharaonic Egypt, if we don't even talk about the civilization that was in place, that Gurdjieff said was in place before dynastic Egypt. For instance, there are over 4,000 hieroglyphics in dynastic Egypt. And although we are supposed to have deciphered the hieroglyphics with the Rosetta Stone, it has been proven that we don't really understand what these hieroglyphics truly mean, because they're couched, much of it is couched in esoteric terms. It's not couched in Western patriarchal, it's not couched in that paradigm. It's couched in a totally different esoteric paradigm. So although we can translate to a certain degree what they mean after a certain fashion, we can't get to the real deep-rooted meaning, because we can't step back into that paradigm. So this is one of the things that's really interesting. We don't really even understand fully dynastic Egypt. And this other civilization that came before, we have absolutely no idea. In fact, we don't even want to talk about it. Nobody even wants to know. All the experts in the world do not want to talk about it. They are not interested. But for me, this is the most interesting part of Egypt, is the pre-pharaonic civilization that Gurdjieff talks about so much. And what Gurdjieff is saying in terms of cognitive ability is that in the past 5,000 years, our cognitive ability has diminished. Now let's be clear about this. He's saying that in many ways our intellectual capacity, that is our ability to remember, to invent, and to use intellectual argument and philosophy, has increased. But our cognitive ability, that's our direct perception of truth, our direct ability to look into a person and see the nature of that person, and our direct ability to look at the cosmos and intuit and to understand the cosmos on a bigger scale, that is, i.e. bigger than the intellectual vision of things, has definitely been muted in the past 5,000 years. It has diminished. And this continues to happen. Our cognitive ability is diminishing century by century, and this is a really big problem for mankind. But if we work spiritually on being, our cognitive ability increases. This is one of the key elements of Gurdjieff's teaching, is that if we work on ourselves, if we are humble enough to do it, sincere enough to do it, and we work at it week on week, year on year, we can definitely increase our cognitive ability.
Because one of the main aims is to get rid of what we would call our personality, which is what you was talking about earlier, is being developed from all our peers and our parents and our culture, and instead find the real essence inside ourselves. Would you like to speak a bit more on that?
Yeah, essence and personality, this is probably one of the fundamental concepts of Gurdjieff. He explains that essence is what we are born with. It is innate. It does not come from society. It is our core, our spiritual core, if you like. And personality is that which we gain from society. We absorb all of the different nuances of society, mannerisms, and how to read, how to write, how to communicate, etiquette, manners, all of these things, even body language, all comes from our society, from our surroundings, from our parents, and this is all personality. But Gurdjieff explained that in esoteric work we must, to a certain degree, render personality passive and begin to work on essence, because essence is the real part of us, personality is the mask. But there is a caveat here, and the caveat is personality is never destroyed. In the beginning of this work, it's never destroyed, because we need personality to navigate society. We need to check our bank statements, we need to communicate with our friends on the computer, we need to read maps, to travel, we need to do all of these things, and we need to have business meetings, we need to, all of the communication, everything depends on personality. So we mustn't dump personality in the beginning, but later personality takes what is called a backseat. Personality is not so strong. When you begin to work on yourself, essence becomes stronger. And with essence, real cognitive ability, this is how we can connect concepts up in the fourth way. Real cognitive ability comes from essence. It doesn't come from personality. Personality is more like a mechanism, where essence is more that core of you that's looking out from the inside out. That is perception, and qualities and abilities are really should belong to essence. Now there's a really interesting thing here, and that is that most of what we learn in modern day education, most of the so-called qualities and abilities and perceptions are placed in personality. This is the core problem with modern education. All of these things that we learn, these qualities like courage, tenacity, sincerity, humility, sensitivity, all of these things need to be anchored in essence. Now with modern day man, they are anchored in personality. This is a major problem, because when these qualities, which are by the way, the building blocks of our being, our potential for being development and for higher consciousness, we must first of all develop these qualities. But if these qualities are only in the personality, i.e. in the mask, the superficial veneer of the person, then it's not possible to utilize them for higher development. The key and the secret is that we must move those qualities into essence. So those qualities that we hear about and we learn about at school and from our parents must be anchored in essence. And as I said, mostly with the majority of people, these qualities are only in personality. So there you have got a great disjunction between the two main psychological and spiritual aspects of the person. There's a huge disjunction. The qualities and the abilities that a person has should be in their core, in their essence, but they're not. So therefore, that is why we have so many problems in relationships and with friends, even with our parents, because so many people have these qualities and abilities and principles for living in their personality. And personality is very mutable. It changes all the time, different shades and nuances, and also personality is made up of lots of sub-personalities. So these sub-personalities are a problem, because if you, for instance, observe yourself very closely, just to give an example, or perhaps a friend, sometimes it's easier in the beginning to see it in a friend. If you observe a friend over a week very closely, you will see them move seamlessly, move into one sub-personality and yet another sub-personality, and then shift sideways into yet another sub-personality. And often these sub-personalities are evoked from external stimuli or external events or external people. And I'll give you an example. It's very easy to see this, even talking on pagan radio. It's very easy to actually demonstrate this verbally. If you take the average businessman, and he will go to his business meeting before he leaves his office, then he has one sub-persona for his colleagues. And if you were to be a fly on the wall and watching his behavior, you will see a certain persona, a certain behavior, a certain tone of voice, a certain body language. And then when he leaves for a few drinks afterwards with his office colleagues, and he moves to the bar next door, you will see a totally different sub-personality manifest. And then later on that evening, he goes back to his wife and his children, and you will see yet a completely different sub-personality evoked by a new circumstance, that of his home life. So it is very easy to see and to demonstrate, even right now on pagan radio, telling you about it. It's very easy to demonstrate verbally and show you how sub-personalities are in us all the time, and we move between them seamlessly. We don't even notice. So essence and personality, the two key elements of esoteric psychology, and there are three main parts to the Gurdjieff teaching. There is esoteric psychology, there is esoteric alchemy, and esoteric cosmology. Those are the three main aspects. And in the beginning, we study esoteric psychology because it forms a basis and a foundation for the other two.
And also we become, with the first part, you're sort of learning a bit about yourself and about people, and one of the most important quotes for doing this kind of work is know thyself. So that's a good first step to be doing.
That's it. Know thyself is very, very important, yet very, very difficult for modern people to know themselves. It's incredibly difficult, because here's one of the keys, is that our society, our culture, drives personality. It drives personality as a child's bicycle or an adult's bicycle. The pedals and the chain drives the bicycle. So that power coming from the person on the bicycle, if you take society to be the person actually on the bicycle, and the bicycle to be your personality, if you like, then society, outer events, and all the pressures drive. They're the motivating force behind, the animating force behind personality. So it is quite difficult for modern people to move into essence. It's not that easy done, but it is the key pivotal element of spiritual work in the Gurdjieff teaching. And I can give you an example on this, because a lot of people don't understand how we can move into essence. So I'm going to give you one example on this so that it makes it easier to understand the difference between personality and essence in life, in society. We can meet people on the street, we can meet people in restaurants, and we can observe how they behave and what they talk about and their body language and etc., etc. But if we were to go to, for example, I'll just take one example of people working on essence in society, a Buddhist monastery, which I've been to myself, sat with the monks, including a female monk, and observed their being manifestations, observed their body language, observed with sensitivity their energy, their actual energy coming from their being and from their bodies. You will see that they have a different order of manifestation, and it's simply because they have moved into essence and they are working on essence every day. So they have withdrawn from the world so that they can full-time work on essence. So that's just to give you an example. But the fourth way is not about withdrawing from the world. The fourth way, although at some point during the fourth way, during the past that Gurdjieff has brought to the West, at some point one can withdraw, and that withdrawal is usually to a school, a wisdom school. That is usually for a definitive amount of time. It's not indefinite, nor is it in any way resemble the way of the monk, where you go to a monastery and you spend the rest of your life there. It is just not like that in any way. It is merely, if you do withdraw to a school, a wisdom school that Gurdjieff talked about, then it is for a definitive amount of time and it's for a definitive purpose. And you're going there to achieve something very specific for yourself. It's not vacuous, it's not something that, it's very specific. You go to the school for very specific reasons. Whereas you can spend a lot of time in a monastery and you may not gain the inner development that you wish for in the very beginning. You may be disappointed because Gurdjieff explains with the way of the monk lacks certain knowledge that the fourth way has access to, that esoteric schools have access to. Similarly with the way of the yogi and the way of the fakir, they're working on one part of their being. They're either working on the physical part, the intellectual part, or the emotional part, whereas we need to work on all three parts simultaneously if we want to make progress. So the fourth way is the way of the man and the woman in life. And the fourth way, and esotericism in particular, pays great attention to the feminine principle. And the feminine principle is extremely important in esotericism, and many esoterists don't fully understand the divine feminine principle or the feminine principle. It's in Taoism as yin and yang, or the Tao, the two components of the Tao, which continually move in motion and are attached to one another in a specific way. But the divine feminine principle, we have basically a patriarchal society. And recently I was watching a documentary on my computer called The Pyramid Code. And this lady, a PhD in Egyptology, her name is Carmen Bolter, she was talking about this, how modern day peoples mostly are under the auspices of this patriarchal system. And I believe this patriarchal system we have today is very different than the ancient patriarchal system than they had in olden times. But it's really interesting what she said about the matriarchal system. She said that people generally presume that the matriarchal system is the opposite to the patriarchal system. She said that people generally believe that the matriarchal system was where the feminine principle, or the woman, was in the ascendant. And she explains that this is not at all what matriarchy is about. She said matriarchy is about where the man and the woman are equal. And there is a great respect for women, far different than today. And this respect for the woman comes from this deep understanding of the divine feminine principle. It doesn't come from any philosophy or any moral teaching that one might get at school or from one's parents. It comes from, Gurdjieff explains, a very deep understanding of what the divine feminine is about. And actually, the divine feminine is a very difficult, unlike personality and essence, the divine feminine principle is quite a difficult principle to explain without some background and without going into various different nuances and facets of esotericism. But basically the divine feminine principle, Gurdjieff, let's explain it from the point of view of the Gurdjieff teaching. Gurdjieff explains that in the universe, from the absolute, which modern day people call God, Gurdjieff explains that there is an outpouring of energy in the form of the ray of creation. And this ray of creation, which issues from the absolute, comes in a downward fashion, metaphorically speaking, and it creates all the starry worlds, all the galaxies, the suns, our sun, the earth, and the moon, which is basically a planetoid. And this ray of creation, this energy which issues forth from the absolute, it actually stops at a point just beyond the moon, and this is called absolute void. So we go from a point called absolute, what modern people call God, to a point beyond our physical moon, which is called absolute void. And then a really interesting thing happens, is that this energy reverts in a loop fashion and moves back up the stream, back to the absolute. And this is called a path of return. And this is the divine feminine principle. In the Kabbalah, it's represented by the snake.
Going up the ladder.
Yes, and it's also represented by many modern day occultists as the Kundalini force. So this force that issues from the absolute and then reverts and loops back from this absolute void back to the absolute actually exists also in the human being. This is what's really interesting. If you were to take it in an anatomical way, in a biological anatomical way, the energy comes down through the top of the head, through the higher centers, down through all the centers in the body, into the ground, and then it loops and it goes back up either side of the spine into the two hemispheres of the brain. And this is the return force that goes back up. But here's the caveat. In modern day people, the force does travel downwards, but the backward force in most people is just a trickle. Now, the secret is we have to make that trickle a force, a very powerful force. And this is one of the reasons why Gurdjieff brought sacred dancing to the West. Because the sacred dancing, its main objective and its main role was to create from a trickle a very powerful force that would move in the body and move backwards into the two higher centers which are situated in the head. So this is the path of return, and this is the divine feminine principle. It is the force issuing out from the absolute downwards, if you want to use the word downwards. This is classified as affirming, and the force which returns is classified as it's a totally different force. It's returning to the absolute, and when this force returns to the absolute, there's a reconciling factor comes into play. So in the human being, we don't have this force returning to the higher centers, and this divine feminine principle, once we realize how important it is, how potent and powerful it is, and all of the feminine symbols in nature and in religion and esotericism, they all point to this returning force. And as Gurdjieff explains, we must find a way to piggyback, in inverted commas, we must find a way to piggyback on this return force. And actually the mechanism, the methodology of doing this is esoteric work. And in the beginning, it's esoteric study and the absorption of esoteric materials and then applying it to our lives. So this is the divine feminine. We see this in the Da Vinci Code as well, the divine feminine, which was mistakenly represented by Mary Magdalene. Now, of course, Mary Magdalene is a feminine principle, and she should obviously be rightly recognized. And there are many people listening today who will know about the Da Vinci Code and know about Mary Magdalene. But she is not the cosmic divine principle. She is the earthly. She's the mirrored, if you like, the mirrored aspect of the divine feminine. Not to take anything away from Mary Magdalene in the slightest. But the divine feminine is completely different than any one person or genre of people. It doesn't. Mary Magdalene in the Da Vinci Code is not exactly correct. So just to mention that.
Because what it is the energy's coming down from the gods. I'm just saying this in simplistic form. Energy's coming down from the gods to Earth, and then we can develop it to send it back up. But it's how we are developed as to what energy we send back to the gods. So it's like a circle.
This, in a way, what you're saying is correct, because when we develop this energy in ourselves, and this energy is going back into the two higher centers, we have 7 chakras, 5 lower chakras and 2 higher chakras, and the 2 higher chakras are in the head. So the energy in the lower part of the human being can be diverted upwards into the brain, as it were, and this is connected with Kundalini yoga and work with Kundalini energies. But essentially speaking, the truth of this is that the human being has to be prepared in a certain way before you undertake this work, because if these energies enter the brain, from the lower chakras without doing the necessary cleansing and readjustment of the lower chakras, basically the person just goes insane, because the energy that will enter the higher chakras, the higher centers in the head, will be unclean. It will be tainted, and it will be full of all sorts of impurities, and also wrong types of energy as well, because the 5 lower centers have to be aligned and purified and made to function properly and naturally before this can happen. So this is the divine feminine principle. It's the path of return, and all high-level initiates in Sufism and on the Fourth Way and other paths, they know exactly what the divine principle means. And in Christianity, it was once represented by the Black Madonna. We often see statues of the Black Madonna, and you speak to the clergy, you speak to priests, and they will give you an explanation for the Black Madonna, that it was a mistake or whatever, blah, blah, blah. But actually the Black Madonna represents esotericism. It represents the divine feminine principle.
Because usually the Black Madonna's with a child as well, isn't she? Yes. Because it's meant to be, they say it's originally Isis and Horus. And that's the divine feminine energy from back in ancient Egypt times.
That's it, yeah.
But you discuss all this in your workshops.
That's correct.
And this is what you work on, and if someone comes to your workshop, obviously they progress in all this. But you're also working on a book on this called Opening the Inner Mind.
Yes,
I've got the title right. Yep.
You've hit on a very, very important principle, opening the inner mind. And I think this principle is so important that I'm going to read to you one of the opening pages of this new book. And it's called The Three Minds. And the 3 minds is such a pivotal concept that it's really worth just reading this out to you, because it's so important. So the first mind is the sensual mind, or the intellectual mind. And we find this everywhere in society. Now this mind is based on logic, contemporary science, the 5 senses. And people who are possessed of this paradigm of thinking and looking at life, it's a belief system. Only believes what is seen or proved by science. Represents a specific mindset in society, as I said. The interesting thing is science cannot understand, or a scientifically minded person can't understand a person who operates from the inner mind. They will seem totally illogical to the scientifically minded or logically minded person. They will just not be able to understand that person. The sensual mind is a very limited and deceptive cognitive function. Unable to comprehend real and authentic esoteric wisdom, this level of mind tends to be very homocentric. That is, everything revolves around man. Yeah, everything in the universe revolves around me, so to speak. And also very egocentric. So in esotericism, this is classified as one-centered cognition and thinking, intellectual center. So then there is the second type of mind, and that is the intermediate mind, or emotional mind. This is belief systems, emotionalism, the belief in something, religion or creed. Again, it represents a very specific mindset in society at large. Emotionally centered people cannot understand a person who's centered in the inner mind. This is another thing. It's unreliable. This form of mentation or cognition is unreliable as a cognitive function because it lacks depth and veracity. And people who think this way or perceive in this way are naive about life and living. Again, this is one-centered cognition, the emotional center. And now we come to the third mind, and this is called the inner mind. This is a really important concept. The inner mind combines the intuitive awareness with the emotional center and the intellectual center. So we have 3 centers working together as one triad, as one unit, as opposed to with the sensual mind or intellectual mind, you've only got 1 center. And with the emotional mind or intermediate mind, again, you've only got 1 center. So with the inner mind, it's a totally different kettle of fish. This is also called psychological thinking or psychological awareness. The use of 3 centers simultaneously and engaging the higher parts of centers, because each center is divided into 3. So the inner mind really represents using 3 centers and the higher parts of those centers all at once, at one time, simultaneously. The inner mind does not accept the conclusions of the sensual mind or the intermediate mind. It represents a new cognitive function in ordinary man. We are actually supposed to have this cognitive function naturally, but we no longer do so, like I just mentioned earlier about the diminishing of man's cognitive abilities. So this is an example of it. The inner mind in each of us is vastly superior to either the sensual mind or the intermediate mind. It has higher cognitive powers, which the others do not have access to. All initial esoteric work concerns opening this particular inner function in the individual. This function opens the perceptions to the need for prolonged inner work. It cannot be faked before those whose inner mind is already opened. So there we have it.
Now your workshops, 'cause I've just noticed where the time's going, we'll have to close up soon. If someone wanted to come along to them, do you have a website they can go through, or how would they contact
Yes,
you?
it's www.openingtheinnermind.weebly.com, and Weebly is spelled Weebly. So it's openingtheinnermind.weebly.com.
Okay.
And there is one quotation that I would like to read before we finish,
Yep.
if that's okay, because it's a very, very powerful quotation. And this quotation is from Osho, and it's about approaching the esoteric path. It's about approaching truth. It's about people opening up to something new and to be willing to look at new things. So I'll read out the quotation to you, which is actually a very, very special and very powerful quotation. The new does not arise out of you. It comes from the beyond. It is not part of you. Your whole past is at stake. The new is discontinuous with you, hence the fear. You have lived in one way. You have thought in one way. You have made a comfortable life out of your beliefs. Then something new knocks on the door. Everybody in the world wants to become new, because nobody is satisfied with the old. Nobody can ever be satisfied with the old, because whatever it is, you have known it. Once known, it has become repetitive. Once known, it has become boring, monotonous. You want to get rid of it. You want to explore. You want an adventure. You want to become new. And yet, when the new knocks on the door, you shrink back. You withdraw. You hide in the old. This is the dilemma.
That's brilliant, Joe. It's a wonderful way to end the show. I'd like to wish you all the luck with your books and your workshops.
Thank you.
And thank you again. This is Debbie for Occult Lives signing out. See you next time. Bye.